G'day Legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic midweek. Now Legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to go over. Of course, we'll be looking at the maps, we'll be comparing maps and talking about where movements are and what this means for the bigger picture. We also need to look at comments made by Mr. Steve Witkoff, by JD Vance, by Zelensky, and where the Kremlin may be sitting in negotiations, and where is the US, who is trying to put themselves as the mediator here, realistically the only country actually trying to find an end to this war that would be timely. Where is that actually sitting? And we know the US, well, they're the most powerful country on the earth. They have a huge amount of leverage, and that leverage can be through promised opportunity as well. So we'll go over that as well. Now, a lot of people have requested I talk about this, and I think it is something worth talking about because it does show some irony, some hypocrisy, and also how global politics and global strategies are shifting. We'll go over the article that came out talking about Russia's request to put long-range strategic nuclear-capable bombers in Indonesia, of course, just north of Australia. Now, this got shot down very quickly by both Indonesia and Australia, and even the Kremlin said it was just misinformation. But I think this, if we extrapolate on it, tells us a lot about strategic movements around the world and how there is what is right versus what is reality also. But where I want to start is this. Of course, coming up on May 9th, then is Victory Day. Of course, when the Soviet Union, they declared victory over Nazi Germany. And what we have seen is the EU, they are saying that there will be consequences for those who attend this memorial. Now, this comes from the Prime Minister of Slovakia, speaking about Miss Kaja Kallas, the EU's High Representative, and someone we've spoken about on this channel a lot. Now, this is then translated with ChatGPT-4 because Facebook's translation sucks. But the warning and threat from Ms. Kallas are disrespectful, and I reject them. The EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Kaja Kallas, warns EU leaders against attending the May Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. Allegedly, participation will not be taken lightly. I will go to Moscow on May 9th. Is Mrs. Kallas warning blackmail or an announcement that I will be punished upon returning from Moscow? I don't know, but I do know it is the year 2025, not 1939. Kallas's warning confirms that we in the EU need a discussion about the essence of democracy. JD Vance, he has said very similar, about what happened in Romania and France regarding the presidential elections, the kind of Maidans the West is orchestrating in Georgia or Serbia, and how the abuse of criminal law against the opposition in Slovakia was ignored. Mrs. Kallas, I would like to inform you that I am the legitimate Prime Minister of Slovakia, a sovereign country. No one can dictate to me where I may or may not travel. I'll go to Moscow to pay respect to the thousands of Red Army soldiers who died liberating Slovakia, as well as the millions of other victims of Nazi savagery, just as I've paid tribute to the victims of the Normandy landings in the Pacific, and as I will bow before RAF pilots. And let me remind you, I am one of the few in the EU who constantly speaks about the need for peace in Ukraine and do not belong among the fervent supporters of continuing this senseless war. In the words of Mrs. Kallas, are disrespectful, and I reject them. Now, the Telegraph are reporting that the EU will ban Serbia's accession into the EU if the president joins Putin's Victory Day parade. So that is punishment put on there. The Politico, they also report that Kyiv, they are then asking EU officials for May 9th to come to Ukraine to counter Putin's Victory Day parade. These are leaders from the, quote, coalition of the willing. Now, I hate when military remembrance memorials are used for political gains. I absolutely hate it, whether it is this all the way through to Anzac Day in Australia. Now, Putin does this. He compares the struggle against Nazi Germany to what is currently going on in Ukraine. But on the other hand, the EU is now disrespecting the millions who gave their lives to end the Nazi Germany rule and savagery. And who can forget the Canadian Parliament incident, changing a bit of history. Now, of course, this memorial, this remembrance too, this includes huge numbers of Ukrainians. Ukraine was also in the Soviet Union. People like to just forget that. The very famous image of the Soviet flag being raised over Berlin, the photo shows Russian and a Georgian soldier, but the one who actually raised the flag first was a Ukrainian, Alexei Berest. Yet, we're here watching another step in the EU's ambition to fight authoritarians with authoritarianism. And you know where that ends up? In the same place as each other. Now, speaking on May 9th, I think the best way this has ever been put forward was actually by Mark B. Smith. And he said, the fight to the death between Nazism and communism was the bloodiest in history. The Soviet side responded with atrocities of its own, but the Red Army veterans and their descendants are entitled to remember their victory as the culmination of a moral struggle with the darkest forces of the 20th century. So I just see this again as what we're continually seeing, and it's increasing, just EU overstep on their own sovereign democratic countries that sit within it. And that is a lot of pressure being placed on them. So let's then have a look at the maps and see where things are. Here we have Ukraine in the center of your screen, in the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The red check, this is ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. Now, we do have a few places to look. We're going to go north and then into the south. So the first place we'll look is between Kursk in Russia, Sumy in Ukraine. Now, there's no actual changes on the occupied ground back into Kursk, but according to Syriac maps, there is of Russian occupied ground back into Ukraine. And we just need to move this to the west a little bit, and we see Vasilivka around here. Now, this is something that is not lining up on the maps, at least red to red, but grey to red somewhat is. So you can see the grey around Basivka, Vasilivka, Zoravkia in here. And this is showing that there's at least been some Russian crossing back. And Syriac is saying that the last 3 days, the Russian army made new advances south of Zoravka and Vasilivka, approaching to the locality of Bilovody. So moving on to this locality here of Bilovody. So keep an eye out on what is actually happening up in here. And of all the political sensitive areas to then change what is happening here, at least in the informational space, this is probably the most sensitive of them. Now we'll continue down into the northeast, of course, where Russia has crossed then the Oskil. So let's bring up then this map here. Now, during the last 4 days, Russian army took control over new positions inside Kamyanka, taking control over half of the locality. So this is Kamyanka in here. So we do see a bit of grey zone in here, but he's saying that it has crossed more into here and is expanding control as well. Then we'll move our way down. I believe next will be then Siversk. Now, no changes in here, but remember I showed you last week that there are claims of very large, significant shifts in here, but it's hard to tell because we don't have all maps showing it, and also we don't have any geolocations to then confirm this. But what we are seeing here is this is the chalk quarry, still shown in green on here, and there's movements right out into this area in here by Syriac maps. But he's showing that not only has Russia expanded some of their control in around the vicinity of my cursor now, but Ukraine has also then pushed back in some areas too. So what is actually happening here? It is really, really difficult to know. The area shown as blue in this would be sitting just where my cursor is at the moment. So well behind where the front line for deep state is actually showing. So I guess wait out on that one. Then we'll move our way down into then Toretsk. Now, no changes shown on this map today. Toretsk is one of those areas that is so fluid and there's not really a stable line. It's very difficult to know. Syriac is saying the Ukrainian army recaptured new positions in this district here. So it sits just above where then these Terrakons are, just where my cursor is currently. And then we'll move down into, I'm calling then the East Pokrovsk front. And what we can see, Suka-Balka, there's been further Russian advancement here. There's also video geolocated to right about here of Russian troops assaulting a Ukrainian position as well today. But we can see there is a bit of envelopment now occurring on this front. And I believe I do have, yes I do, a Syriac map. He's showing further control just to the south of Suka-Balka as well. Realistically, these are very, very close considering the differences in some areas of the maps. So we do know there's been some shift around here, then confirmed. Pokrovsk sector. So if we go back to yesterday and then today, we see in the direction of Novi Trud, we do see a Ukrainian advancement here. Then we turn this back on for today and we can see just north of where the Zaporizhia town sits, we do see a further movement for the Russian forces as well. During the last 4 days, Russian army took control over new parts of Lysivkia, so just in here, shown right here, and re-entered Udashny just in here, not being shown on this map. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army re-entered this area from the north, and this sits just to the east of Zelene, but not showing this part in here. But we do have a second Syriac maps update, and then he is showing this part right in here, as well as where the Russians advanced, shown on this Syriac map as well. So we can confirm both of those movements, at least to the bar that I have to show where things have moved on these maps. So let's move our way down, and of course an area you'll be familiar with of Velika Novosilka. Now there is a slight change on this map today. If we go back from yesterday to today, we just see a reduction in control here. It's not blue, but we just see a reduction in Russian control back to then the Mokryali southern side, at least according to this. And then let's bring up our Syriac map, see what this is saying here. And then on this front, during the last 4 days, heavy fighting between Russia and Ukrainian army on the eastern outskirts of Shevchenko. So remember, this front shows vastly different in here. So if we actually zoom in right where this grey zone is shifting, that is said that it is red on this map and that there has been some advancement in here, but very, very minimal realistically. So that will end our mapping for today. So let's have a look at then some of the comments that have been made. Now, Steve Witkoff, he has then, of course, been having meetings with advisors in Russia. He's been on Fox News and has made some comments here. Now, these are not his actual comments. I just wrote this as we were going, but it's words to the effect of. He's asked, is a deal emerging, or is Putin stalling? And we have gone over at length why Putin may actually be stalling and why that does make sense given the essence of this war. And he does say towards the end of their discussions, we got to what Putin's request is. Now, he doesn't really give what that request actually is, although we can probably make a fair guess. He's then asked, will the deal include things that are out of the box? Business with the US, maybe Europe? And Steve Witkoff says, well, the peace deal is about the so-called 5 territories. Of course, the 4, we've seen movement from then Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, as well as Crimea. Of course, we know that Russia is laying again claim and control over. But he says there's so much more to it. NATO, not NATO, what Article 5 is and what security protocols may be in place. But a lot of people have picked up on that 5 territories, including Mr. Zelensky. On top of that, there could be an opportunity to reshape the Russian-US relationship through some compelling commercial opportunities. And he says that partnerships, these create stability between nations. And of course, this has fired up a lot of people. And Zelensky, he has reacted to this at a press conference with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. He said Ukraine is a sovereign state and all territories belong to the unified state of Ukraine. Therefore, again, only the people of Ukraine can speak about the territories of our state. And you know that for us, it is a red line to recognise any temporarily occupied territories as not Ukrainian but Russian. Therefore, again, the relevant representatives are discussing issues outside their competence. The Wall Street Journal, they've reported that Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg are urging Trump to resist territorial concessions to Moscow. But it appears that Trump is siding with Witkoff, and he's arguing that Putin is interested in reaching a peace deal as quickly as possible. According to Reuters, Witkoff told Trump that recognising Russian control over the 4 partially occupied regions would be the quickest way to secure a ceasefire. And as I stated yesterday, this would be the minimum I would expect to see if there was an end to the war now. Any different to this, I believe we would have to see large military actions or then further economic strain. For military actions, we'd have to see NATO either step up support or I guess extend the war. This is going to take a lot of time. And I believe that Trump is more interested in ending the war sooner rather than later. He's more interested in ending it sooner, maybe not in the perfect conditions, but for a gamble of what may end up more, but it can also end up a lot less as well. That's why I believe he's siding with Witkoff, because the other strategies put forward require massive investment and a huge gamble on operations as well. A lot of the strategy towards this war was for Russia to fail, not for Ukraine to succeed in their operations. That's why we saw so much emphasis put on economic sanctions. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has said that Steve Witkoff, he believes that Russia wants to end this war, and the president believes that as well. We've heard Trump say this. There is an incentive for Russia to end the war, and perhaps that could be economic partnerships with the US. But we need to see a ceasefire first, and the president and the president's envoy, Witkoff, made that very clear to the Russians. So you need a ceasefire before we move on to any other partnerships. What I see Trump doing is I think Trump in the near future will issue an ultimatum to both Ukraine and Russia. Now, of course, in this, the US has far more leverage over Ukraine. And I think that Putin, he knows that he can play ball here a little bit. As long as he at least shows Trump that he's ready for peace negotiations, but he will present this on terms that of which Zelensky will never agree to, but he will show to Trump that, well, in good faith, I'm ready to on this, and that Zelensky's far, far away saying, no, we're not going to recognise any of that. That is our red line. I think part of the problem that can then evolve from here, and I think what Putin could actually be relying on a little bit, is that due to that ultimatum, the US then cuts support to Ukraine because they're trying to pin it or present it as it's Ukraine not willing to come to the table. And what Putin will want here is the US to cut support to Ukraine and potentially still pursue economic deals with Russia. I think that's why Putin is playing along, playing ball, stalling this, but try and still play ball with then Trump and Witkoff as well. Does that make sense? Present it that it's that side not being willing, not you. Because at the end of the day, seeing the situation on the front line, the requests that Ukraine have militarily are much larger than Russia's, at least where we see the front lines moving, and those that believe protracted attritional warfare is linear, idiots. They've never looked at any other protracted warfare. What we do see, though, is we do see the friction between Ukraine and the US continue to boil. It hasn't really come down. And what we have seen is a lot of criticism from Zelensky towards the US around Russian narratives, support, weapons, all of this. And we have seen a warning from the US previously not to do this. And JD Vance has said to this media outlet as well, I think it's sort of absurd for Zelensky to tell the American government, which is currently keeping his entire government and war effort together, that we are somehow on the side of the Russians. That kind of rhetoric is certainly not productive. And of course, this comes in response to Zelensky's comments on CBS 60 Minutes, claiming basically that Washington has fallen for Russian narratives and the Russian influence there. Now, Vance has also said in this, it's not good for Europe to be the permanent security vassal of the US. And this is correct. It is not good for Europe to be completely reliant on the US for not only defense, but also energy and trade. And we're seeing this with what has occurred when the US tariffs you, and then as well when you cut off your other main supplier of energy. Remember, there are three pillars of sovereignty: defense, energy, and trade. And at the moment, especially since the beginning of this war, Europe heavily lent all US on those. The problem is, if they start pushing back on that, where do you go from there? You become a bit of a vassal state. Now, the funny thing is, this is somewhat to the US's advantage because they have so much influence into Europe and Asia, but we know the current administration sitting in the White House, they are very inward looking, at least in some areas. Now, let's talk about the Russian bombers in Indonesia. Now, what is being shared is that Indonesia mulls options after Russia seeks access to an Air Force base. Let's give a bit of background on this before we go into it. Now, there's been news websites report that Moscow has launched an official request to base Russian aircraft at the Manahua Air Force Base in the Biak Number 4 in the Indonesian province of Papua. Indonesia's defence minister has assured Australia it would not allow Russian planes to be based in Papua. Deputy PM Richard Marles, Australian, said, "I've spoken to my counterpart, this gentleman, the Minister for Defence, and he has said to me, in the clearest possible terms, reports of the prospect of Russian aircraft operating from Indonesia are simply not true." The ABC, our government-funded media in Australia, they report today the Kremlin, when asked about the report that Russia has asked Indonesia for permission to base aircraft in its territory, said there was a lot of fake news around. But what we see here is an opinion many have picked up. We see this from an Australian, Drew Pavlo, a well-known Twitter blogger. Australia must never allow a Russian airbase on our doorstep. I call on the Australian government to prevent this by any means necessary. By that, I would say that if it was kinetic means, that is, fits within any means necessary. Now, you see a lot of people here are calling out. So now you can understand why Russia will never allow NATO base in Ukraine, or are you just a hypocrite by any means? So you would justify an invasion. Do you not see the irony? Now, myself as an Australian, of course, I sit on the side of that I do not want a strategic ally of China basing their long-range bombers in Australia. But I'm also on the side that sovereign independent states can choose their own security arrangements. Something that Mr. Drew and others like this have been claiming for then years now, of course, and I agree that Ukraine joining NATO, sovereign state, can choose its own security guarantees. But at the end of the day, you need to know that there's going to be flow-on effect from this also. But this is where the irony and hypocrisy is being called out from. Whether it is Ukraine joining NATO, Australia joining AUKUS, or if Indonesia, they want to move further towards a Sino, so Chinese-Russian relationship. They need to understand, though, Indonesia, that it will affect our relationship and trade, just as we understand it will affect trade when we form different then alliances or relationships as well. But the irony and hypocrisy that we would by any means necessary prevent this is astonishing when you see the comments about that sovereign independent states, they can choose their own security arrangements, except if it is not in our favour. Now, this is, of course, a map here. We can see where then this Air Force base is in Indonesia, Australia, you have China, and of course, Taiwan. Now, you need to remember that Indonesia, they have a population of 285 million people. Massive, massive population. So just for this experiment, let's say that it is true that Russian bombers are going to be stationed here. In my opinion, this is not about attacking Australia. It is a deterrence, a blockade force positioned between America's closest ally, Australia, where it has huge forces stationed, and, of course, China. And this would strengthen Russia's relationship with China and be a strategic consideration for the West in the defence of Taiwan. So let's go a little bit further on this. Now, there is a fight for global hegemony that has been building for a few decades. Of course, Trump, he has hit the bloody NOS buttons and accelerated this with his tariffs massively. Of course, what we are seeing is these consequences of tariffs and reliance on any one state and that trade war that then happened. And there is a growing push for countries to have a more healthy balance of sovereignty. So a balance between where you get your energy, where you do trade, and then where you get your defense items from as well. So there is a shift, and Trump has sped that up. We see, just like JD Vance's comments, is confirming that in Europe. And due to this, we may see very large shifts in relationships as countries sort of hedge their bets of who will win this war of hegemony, or if it evolves into then dual powers at the top, the US and China. Also, I've spoken about this before, but do not underestimate how influential for the majority of the world the US-backed and supported Israeli actions in Gaza have been and will continue to be, especially on a country of 280 million people who have 87% Muslim population, so about 242 million. We saw this with Indonesia's foreign ministry, them saying that they strongly reject any attempt to forcibly displace Palestinians after Trump suggested permanently moving Palestinians out of Gaza. So what I've said is some of Trump's actions have sped this up, and you may see not wanting to be wholly reliant on one or another state to somewhat hedge your bets. Now, this isn't about right or wrong, because right, morally, whatever, would be that any state can choose their own then military strategic relationships and alliances and X, Y, and Z, but we don't live in that. Many do. Kaja Kallas, she lives in her own authoritarian and idealist, whatever the fuck it is, world, but that's not how the real world works. In the real world, the goals of powerful nations, their actions and their world order, and their diplomats exercising strategic sympathy and diplomacy do influence states around them. This may not be fair, but unless you are a major, sovereign, independent nuclear power, and especially if you sit in a strategic location, you will be at times coerced into economic, political, or military decisions. Here are some examples. Cuba in 1961 and the Bay of Pigs invasion. The government, they moved towards socialism and aligning with the Soviet Union. America take action. Cuba in 62, the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, with Soviet nuclear weapons. The US with Solomon Islands, 2022, they had threats of military actions if Chinese bases are established. So in that same area of the world we're talking about. Russia, of course, the war that we are looking at. They, of course, launched military actions to block Ukraine's tilt towards NATO and the EU. Georgia in 2008 with the Russia-Georgian War, seeking NATO membership and to support breakaway regions. China, well, Taiwan has been ongoing and they conduct military drills, airspace incursions and threats of invasion. They used to deter Taiwan from declaring independence or forming defence pacts. Now, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but what I'm saying is these powerful nations, they use this coercion and, at the very end, military operations to get the way they want and see. And the war that Russia has launched in Ukraine, or invasions that America has launched before, or then China with ongoing military actions as well, this is part of it. It's not right, it's not fair, but at the end of the day, these behemoth countries will push their will onto other nations. What is brought up all the time is, imagine if, say, Australia thought, we actually want to move more in the direction of a Chinese security guarantee, how quickly do you think it would be until there was real threats or even military actions made? And this is something that I think is greatly misunderstood. And Professor Mearsheimer, he has coined the term strategic sympathy. In other words, understanding how other states see the world, especially their security concerns and motivations. It doesn't mean agreeing with them, but recognising their perspective to avoid dangerous misunderstandings. He argues Western leaders lacked strategic sympathy for Russia by ignoring how NATO expansion threatened Moscow's sense of security, that everyone said that was bullshit. But if you don't have any ambition to see things through other eyes, even if you disagree with it, you then will underestimate or potentially overestimate those actions and the lengths they're willing to go to as well. This doesn't mean justifying a country's actions or changing your own, although it must be part of your calculus. It is well known Russia would have highly likely reacted to any Ukrainian NATO talks. Russia literally told NATO that we will invade if you do this. Of course, on the other side, Russia should take into account strategic sympathy if they did try and make the move into Indonesia and see how the US or Australia may react. So at the end of the day, the ability to choose your own security, alliances, relationships, guarantees, all of that in a perfect world, you'd be able to choose whatever you would like. But in the real world, where all of us on this channel, I hope, live in, we understand that that may not be the way that the actual world works. Mexico, Canada, they're not going to be able to choose their own if they want to lean another way. And using strategic sympathy as well, you can go, you see why if Russia was saying we're going to invade, that this is where we've ended up in, and we may have been able to actually have this war never happen, as Trump has said. And just as Indonesia should be able to choose their own security relationships, they and their strategic sympathy would have to understand how the US, Australia, and other nations may react to this, but also how China may as well. Legends, you have a fantastic day. You look after yourself, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.